Exactly 1 year ago today, the President of the United States stood in the White House Rose Garden, held up a poster board, and made a promise to the American people. He said prices would fall. He said factories would come roaring back. He said April 2nd would go down in history as, and I'm quoting him directly, the day we began to make America wealthy again. 1 year later, here is what actually happened. The Supreme Court declared his tariffs illegal. The government now owes importers $166 billion in refunds. 89,000 manufacturing jobs have been lost, and the average American household is now paying $600 more per year, with economists warning that the worst is still to come. Welcome to Current Affairs Hub. Today, we are doing something no other channel is doing right now. We're pulling back the curtain on every single promise Donald Trump made on Liberation Day, and we are checking every single one of them against the hard numbers 1 year on. And I guarantee you what we found will shock you. Stay with me to understand just how dramatic this moment is. Let's go back exactly 12 months. April 2nd, 2025. Trump walks into the White House Rose Garden in front of the cameras, the flags, the whole ceremony, and he announces what he calls the most important day in American economic history. He signed an Executive Order 14257, invoking something called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. That's the IEPA. It's a law designed to give presidents special authority during national emergencies. Trump used it to declare that America's trade deficit, the gap between what the U.S. imports and what it exports, constituted a national emergency. And on the basis of that declaration, he announced tariffs on nearly every country on earth. Not just America's rivals, not just China, every country. Major trading partners face rates of up to 50%. China, at one point, faced tariffs 145% so high that trade with the world's second largest economy came to what economists described as a virtual standstill. The White House called these tariffs reciprocal, the idea being that America was simply charging other countries the same rates they charge the U.S. But trade analysts immediately pushed back on that framing. The tariffs, they pointed out, often exceeded what foreign countries actually charged, and in some cases were applied to territories with no meaningful trade relationship with the United States at all, including, remarkably, several uninhabited islands. But the promises? The promises were enormous. Trump said these tariffs would bring in, quote, trillions and trillions of dollars to pay down America's debt. He said manufacturing would be reborn. He said foreign investment would flood in. He said consumer prices would drop. He said, standing there in the Rose Garden, that this would be America's declaration of economic independence. So, 1 year on, how did those promises hold up? Let's start with the big one, the promise that resonated most with working-class voters. The manufacturing jobs. Trump said his exact words, jobs and factories will come roaring back. Here is the reality. From the Tax Foundation, a nonpartisan organization that crunches these numbers for a living. Between April 2025, when the tariffs took effect, and February 2026, the latest data available, the United States lost 89,000 manufacturing jobs. 89,000. Not gained. Lost. And here's what makes this number even more damning. The National Association of Manufacturers, the very industry group that should have been the biggest winner of this policy, ran a survey in March of 2026. They asked manufacturers what their single biggest challenge was. The number one answer? Trade uncertainty and tariffs. Not regulations. Not healthcare costs. Not labor shortages. The tariffs themselves. The policy that was supposed to save manufacturing was ranked by manufacturers as their biggest threat. And that wasn't a one-off result. It was the top answer for 5 consecutive quarters in a row. The Tax Foundation also found that tariff policy changed more than 50 times between Liberation Day and February 2026. 50 changes in less than 12 months. One analyst described it as an uncertainty tax layered on top of the financial costs of the tariffs themselves. And businesses simply stopped making decisions. One Massachusetts manufacturer told Congress, because of the uncertainty, nobody knew what was coming next, and so people just stopped spending. His company's revenue dropped 20% in 2025. Promise one broken. Now, let's talk about your wallet. Trump promised that by making other countries pay, American consumers would actually see prices go down. Lower prices at the shops, less at the checkout. That was the pitch. Here is what the data says. Food prices went up by 1.6% immediately after Liberation Day. That's equivalent to an entire year of prior grocery price inflation, compressed into a single policy announcement. And across all categories, economists of the Council on Foreign Relations found that 2025 tariff actions pushed food prices up by 2.8% and fresh produce by 4%. Sugar and sweet products, things like chocolate candy, soft drinks, are up 5.7% year-on-year as of January 2026, with a further 6.7% projected for the rest of this year. And it doesn't stop there. Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell, the man who runs America's central bank, told reporters last month, and I'm paraphrasing carefully, elevated inflation readings largely reflect a goods sector, which has been pushed up by the effects of tariffs. That is a Federal Reserve chairman saying, in plain terms, tariffs are making your life more expensive, and economists now warn that the full damage hasn't even arrived yet. They estimate a lag of 12 to 18 months before tariff effects fully reach consumers, which means peak pressure is expected between April and October 2026. Right now, as you watch this video. And here's the element of surprise nobody is telling you about. A projection from Democratic senators on the Joint Economic Committee found that American families could end up paying $2,500 more in 2026 on top of the $1,700 extra they already paid in 2025. That's over $4,000 in added costs across 2 years. For $1,000. For a family already squeezed by inflation, that is not liberation. That is the opposite. Promise 2 broken. Now, here is the moment in this story that changed everything. And this is the detail that many people outside of the United States have not fully absorbed. In February 2026, just 6 weeks ago, the United States Supreme Court ruled, in a 9-member decision, that Trump's Liberation Day tariffs were illegal. Let me say that again. The highest court in the land ruled that the President of the United States did not have the authority to impose these tariffs. The court found that the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the law Trump used, does not authorize tariffs. A trade deficit, the court essentially said, is not a national emergency that justifies these sweeping powers. And here's where it gets extraordinary. The government has now been ordered to prepare to refund approximately $166 billion in tariff payments collected over the past year. $166 billion. That money was collected from U.S. importers' businesses that buy goods from overseas who in many cases pass those costs straight on to American consumers. So not only did the tariffs fail to deliver the promised economic boom, not only did they raise prices for ordinary Americans, but the entire legal foundation they were built on has now been struck down by the Supreme Court as unconstitutional. Trump's response? He immediately moved to reimpose a 10% tariff through a different legal mechanism, Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974, for a temporary 5-month period. And on April 2, 2026, exactly 1 year after Liberation Day, he announced fresh new tariffs, this time targeting pharmaceutical imports, with a 100% tariff on certain branded drugs and new duties on steel, aluminum, and copper. Now let's zoom out, because this story doesn't just affect Americans. It affects every country that trades with the United States. And the reverberations are being felt across the globe. Global investors, who once treated U.S. assets as a safe haven of the world, have spent the past year quietly and in some cases not so quietly rethinking that assumption. A February 2026 survey by the German Chamber of Commerce and Industry found that 50% of German companies with U.S. business plan to invest less in the United States or to postpone investment entirely in response to tariff policy. And here's the number that really stings. Trump promised that foreign investment would flood into the U.S. to avoid his tariffs. He cited figures in the trillions. But official government data tells a different story. Foreign direct investment into the U.S. in 2025 totaled $288 billion. That sounds large until you realize it was below the 10-year average. It was lower than every year from 2021 to 2024. The investment surge never came. Meanwhile, in financial markets, something unprecedented has happened. Analyst investment firm A.J. Bell gave a name, the abuse of trade, anywhere but the United States. For the first time in more than a decade, global investors have been systematically moving capital away from American assets toward European and Asian markets. The MSCI USA Index has risen 14% since Liberation Day, but the broader global index is up 18%. America is underperforming the world it was supposed to dominate. And in the Middle East, a further complication. The U.S. and Israel launched military action against Iran in early 2026, sending global energy prices sharply higher. Economists warn this could now push inflation even further upward, precisely the moment when tariff-driven price pressure is reaching its peak. The world is changing, and the United States, which was supposed to be liberated by this policy, is now navigating a landscape it did not expect. So where does that leave us today, on April 3rd, 2026? Trump is not backing down. He never backs down. On April 2nd, the one-year anniversary of Liberation Day, his administration launched a new wave of tariffs. 100% on certain branded pharmaceutical imports, revised duties on steel, aluminum, and copper, and his trade representative, Jamieson Greer, stood in front of cameras and defended the entire strategy as a, quote, reset button for a broken global trading system. Trump has also initiated fresh investigations under Section 301 of the Trade Act into unfair trade practices by more than a dozen countries, including China, the EU, Japan, Switzerland, and India. These investigations are the precursor to a whole new wave of tariffs, built on different legal foundations now that the Supreme Court has shut down the IEPA route. And here's the political dimension to this that matters enormously. The midterm elections are approaching. Polls consistently show that these tariffs remain deeply unpopular with voters, at least as unpopular, one analysis noted, as the Iran war itself. Democratic senators gathered this week to mark the anniversary, calling the economic record a, quote, complete failure. But Republicans are caught in a trap. Defend the tariffs and own the economic pain. Break with the president and face his political wrath. There is no clean exit from this story. So here's where we land on the first anniversary of Liberation Day. 1 year ago, President Trump promised the most sweeping transformation of the American economy in a century. He promised it would be painless. He promised the other side would pay. He promised jobs, lower prices, and a flood of investment that would make America rich again. 1 year later, the Supreme Court has ruled his central mechanism illegal. 89,000 manufacturing jobs have been lost. Household costs are up hundreds, potentially thousands of dollars. Foreign investment has declined. And the U.S. economy is now being simultaneously squeezed by tariff-driven inflation and a war that is pushing energy prices higher. And yet, and this is the uncomfortable reality that neither side of this debate wants to sit with, the story is not over. New tariffs are being built on new legal ground. Trade negotiations are ongoing. Some deals have been struck. Japan has pledged $36 billion in U.S. investments, followed by a further $73 billion. South Korea's parliament has passed legislation to formalize its investment commitments. The global trading system is being remade. Whether that remaking ultimately benefits ordinary Americans or whether the costs simply keep rolling in is a question that cannot be answered yet. What we can say on this 1 year anniversary is this: the promises of Liberation Day have not been kept. The price has been real, it has been large, and it has been paid not by foreign governments, not by trading partners, not by distant boardrooms, but by the people standing in the supermarket aisle, looking at the price of groceries, wondering why everything costs more than it used to. That is the story of Liberation Day, 1 year on. If this video gave you something to think about, subscribe to Current Affairs Hub right now and hit the notification bell. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Do you think Trump's tariffs have been worth it? I want to hear every perspective. Share this video, because in a world flooded with noise, the numbers matter. The truth matters. This has been Current Affairs Hub. Stay informed. Stay sharp.